Suppose you're working on the vaccine for a terrible disease. It kills thousands of people each year. And what's more, the people who manage to survive have terrible health consequences for the rest of their lives. Now suppose that you manage to find this vaccine. What should you do with it? Should you give it away? Should you charge as much money for it as you possibly can? Should you save it so that only your friends and family or people that you care about have access to the vaccine? What's more, what would this choice say about you as a person? Why would it be okay for you to do any of the things that I've just outlined? These are the sorts of questions that ethics tries to answer. Ethics is the philosophical study of what it takes to be a good person and how we should live a good life. Can we even figure out what it takes to be a good person? Most ethicists think the answer is yes, although this is very difficult and complicated. We have to not only be able to answer questions like, well, what should we do in the vaccine case, but we also need to be able to answer questions like, what sorts of things we should value in our life, or what moral rules we should follow, or whether there even are any moral rules. Now, it turns out that each of these questions leads to a different sub-area or subfield of ethics. So if we want to understand what ethics is, it might be valuable to start at the bottom, take a look at what these different areas are, and work our way up. The first thing that ethicists are interested in is something called value theory. Value theory asks questions about what's valuable and what makes it valuable, what makes it part of a life that's worth pursuing. For example, suppose that I want to dedicate my entire life to making as much money as possible, or suppose I want to dedicate my life to collecting different kinds of light bulbs. Would those be valuable lives? What would make them valuable? What would make them something that would make it a good life? Once we've sorted this out, the next thing that we want to know is what sorts of moral rules apply, and whether there can even be any moral rules. Metaethics is the study of ethical concepts like good, or bad, or valuable, or universal. If we want to be able to say something about what we should always do and what it takes to be a good person and what kind of life is valuable, we ought to be able to know what those terms mean. Once we've sorted that out, once we know what's valuable and what it means to be valuable or means to be good, for example, we want to be able to figure out what the moral rules are. It may be the case that it's okay for me to pursue money, for example, but I can't just do whatever I want to get money. This is where normative ethics comes in. Normative ethics tries to figure out what the moral rules are and what makes them true. For example, I think we can all agree it would be completely wrong to break my grandmother's vase and lie about it. But that leads to some interesting questions like, what makes it wrong? Is it always wrong to tell a lie? Is it wrong to lie about breaking my grandmother's vase because it doesn't respect her as a person, or it doesn't respect her rights? Or is it wrong because if she found out she would be really unhappy about it? These are precisely the kinds of questions that normative ethics tries to answer. Now, once we have these rules, we can try to apply them to really difficult cases, and that's what applied ethics tries to do. Applied ethics is just that. It's taking the moral rules that we have and applying them to really difficult cases. Now, of course, we probably don't need a really robust, well-developed theory to be able to do things like figure out whether murder is wrong. It is. By the same token, we don't need to have a PhD in mathematics to know that if I see an equation that says x plus 3 equals 7, then x equals 4, or if I see a sentence that says the dog jumped over the fence, I don't need a PhD in linguistics to be able to tell you that the subject of the sentence is the dog. But it can be really useful to not only have the time and space to think about difficult questions, but also to have the sort of theoretical background that'll make answering those questions possible. For example, if I want to do differential calculus, it's going to be really worthwhile to be able to have that mathematical background. I can't just do that off the top of my head like I can basic algebra. By the same token, if I want to know if the sentence buffalo, 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 buffalo is grammatical, it would be really useful to have an understanding of what that word means and how the grammatical rules that we have in our language can be applied to it. Ethics is the same way. Most of the time we'll know what to do without too much of a problem, but there's going to be a lot of tricky cases where it's going to be very helpful for us to take a moment, slow down, think about what the rules are, and think about how they apply. So why study ethics? I can think of a few reasons, ranging from the fact that you may be in an ethics class right now and you want to get credit and understand what's going on so you can get a good grade, to the idea that you might find these puzzles and questions interesting, like you might find a Sudoku or you might find a crossword puzzle interesting. These are good reasons. I don't want to, disparage them or anything like that, but I do want to suggest a deeper reason that studying ethics is really useful. I think that at the end of the day, we're really interested in living a life that has two features associated with it. Number one, we want to live a life that is good, and number two, we want to live a life that is meaningful. In other words, I want to be able to look back on my life and say that I was a good person, or at the very least that I wasn't a bad person. And I also want to be able to look back on my life and say that my life meant something, that it mattered that I existed. Now, I might be able to do both of those things by accident if I don't study ethics. It's certainly possible that you could live a good and fulfilling life without ever actually studying ethics, but why take that risk? Why go through life and ask yourself whether there was something that you would have found deeply meaningful or deeply important, but you just never gave yourself the chance to think about it? Or why go through life and ask yourself, is this thing that I'm doing actually really, really wrong and bad and something that I should be avoiding? These are exactly the kinds of questions that ethics tries to answer. And that's why I hope you'll join me and do some thinking about ethics in your own life. By the way, whether you think that this vaccine question is just an academic exercise that I came up with because we're going through a pandemic right now, it's not. In the 1950s, Jonas Salk developed the polio vaccine and gave it away for free. Forbes magazine estimates that he gave up the equivalent of a $7 billion fortune over his lifetime because he refused to sell the vaccine. When he was asked in an interview who owned the patent to his vaccine, he said, "Well, the people, I would say. There is no patent. Could you patent the sun?" Oh, one more thing. It turns out that the sentence buffalo, 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 buffalo is a grammatical sentence if you accept buffalo as having one of three sort of commonly accepted definitions. Number one, you might think that Buffalo is a city in upstate New York where the Buffalo Bills play. The second thing that you might think is that a buffalo is a bison, a particular kind of animal. And it turns out that buffalo has a third definition. It's a verb that means to bully or intimidate. So if I say buffalo, 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 what I could be saying is bison intimidate other bison from Buffalo, New York, who are themselves intimidated by bison from Buffalo, New York. The more you know.